Hello. Welcome to tonight's edition of Introduction to the Hebrew Bible. It's good as always to be with you all. I think if I prepped this properly, which is always a real question, I think that we will be finishing out the book of Exodus, at least what we're going to do in the book of Exodus tonight. And what we're going to be doing going forward is we're going to be doing a lot more of kind of hitting key themes and subjects within books as we move through the Hebrew Bible. We've really, for almost all of Genesis and a good portion of Exodus, we've kind of followed the whole story. And I did that, as I've said before, because the early parts of the story come back over and over and over again later in the Hebrew Bible. But now that I feel like we've already covered those basic foundational stories, we'll begin to start doing more of a traditional overview style class as you would normally expect, as opposed to what we've been doing so far. So you may really enjoy that, to move at a bit more of a brisk pace through the Bible, or you may be annoyed because we're skipping all these stories you have so many questions about. If you really like it, that's awesome. If you're really annoyed, sorry, it's the way it is. Monday night's my night. So I don't know, just being a little punchy tonight, I think. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive right in. I'm gonna go ahead as normal and mute you all. Feel free, however, to unmute yourself if you have any questions or anything you want to say at any point during the class. The Lord be with you. So to begin as an opening prayer, rather than traditional prayer, I wanted us to begin with the first part of the Decalogue, which forms such an important part of the book of Moses. The book of Moses, the book of Exodus. And so actually, after I just muted you all, I'm going to unmute you all so that you can go ahead and respond. But you can see on our screen that we've got the, I will say the first part, and then there's a response for you all to say after me. God spake these words and said, I am the Lord thy God, who brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have none other gods but me.
Lord, have mercy upon us, and incline our hearts to keep this law.
Thank you. That is always ridiculous when you have everyone talk at the same time on Zoom. But I wanted to do that just because, so the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, used to form a very significant part of Anglican liturgy, and we still get them in bits and pieces every now and then at St. John's. I particularly like to use the Decalogue as a part of the penitential order in Lent. But I love particularly the way that the Decalogue is framed in the Rite One liturgy, not only because you get that weighty kind of King James language of these verses that you've probably heard before, but also because of the way that it's saying these twofold things. It's first off, claiming God's mercy, asking God to have mercy on us, but also not just asking God to have mercy, but asking God to help us to keep the law better. And that twofold reality, to me, which is so central to Anglican spirituality, that we believe very much that we are saved by grace through faith, but at the same time, we also believe that grace should enable us to live more faithfully moving forward. And so you see that in that call and response. And you also see how the Decalogue is framed, at least in this version, very deeply in the Exodus narrative. And that's why these laws matter, is because of the relationship that God has formed with Israel in the stories that we've been following up to this far. So that'd be a good opening for tonight. If you're new or jumping in after a while to our class, there are 3 texts that kind of are our key texts in this class. The version of the Bible I'm using is the NRSV in the New Oxford Annotated Bible with the Apocrypha. Excellent ecumenical study Bible. Kind of a good 1-volume commentary, how to read the Bible book by book, that we're using to kind of ground us in each book as we move through. And then if you really are enjoying the deep dive into Exodus, then the commentary I'd recommend to would be Terence Fretheim's commentary on Exodus, which is right there, that I'm also using as I'm drawing the materials together for this course. So let's do a little review, see how closely you have been paying attention. I'm sure it's been very closely. So as you think back to last week in the plague and the Passover narratives, what genre of literature have we primarily, until right now, primarily been experiencing in, well, Genesis and Exodus, but also in the book of Exodus? You're all unmuted.
Just storytelling.
Storytelling, yeah, it's narrative. It's prose, narrative, story. That's been kind of the heart of what we've been doing, right? That's excellent. Good job, Catherine. And then what genre enters into the picture in Genesis 12 through 15? What do we add in?
Poetry.
Poetry, close. Not quite, though.
Liturgical stuff.
Narrative, liturgy, ritual. Yes, we're getting ritual. It's important to catch that you can't read ritual the same way you read prose, right? And I talked about that, how in the ritual liturgy, the Passover is made present once more, over and over again for the people, whereas in a prose liturgy, oh, thank you, my love. This is my dinner. We're having a little manicotti tonight. Whereas that was the light. Did you turn the light back on? Oh, sorry. Whereas in prose history, you're kind of reading something that happened. So there's that kind of liturgical difference going on as we begin to start playing with different genres. Good job. Excellent job. And then also, just as a example of that, I showed you this chart last week as well that shows how what you have is you have the entire story of plague and Passover encapsulated by liturgy, as well as using liturgy to enclose individual stories within the narrative text, if you remember that stunning screenshot from Fratheim's commentary. And then how then do we read that interplay between history and ritual, right? The historical event is the liturgical event. Remember how those two kind of blend together when you're doing a liturgical reading of a text. So we're seeing that making present again. Does anyone remember that fancy $5 liturgical word for making something present again that I use? Father Kenneth can't answer. Anyone other than Father Kenneth?
Yes, I can, but at once. I'm forbidden.
I want to see Jared if he's the one who's talking.
Anamnesis, to make present once more. Also, another little bit of review stuff. We generally tend to think of Moses as the hero of Exodus and Pharaoh as the villain. But what did we learn when we paid attention to the main characters as they were presented in the text? Who's the main character of the Exodus narrative?
God.
Nice, God, that's correct. And we saw that because Pharaoh, of course, remember, appeared 103 times, and Moses 136, but God or the Lord 207 times. So that's the dominant force happening in this. Even when Moses or Pharaoh are active, it's often in response to the activity of God, who's the one strategizing and driving the story, the main character. Excellent. Great review stuff. Great review stuff. And apparently I put that slide in there twice because I was just really sure you missed it. All right. We're going to do an excursus. So I'm going to mute you all again while we work through this. This is one of those bizarre text times where there's some kind of just like really, so if you want to talk, unmute yourselves. But I'm muting you all right now. So there's this, sometimes we come across these very just weird, bonkers stories in the Bible. And one of them is found in Exodus 4, verses 24 through 26. We're going to turn there right now, and I'm going to read that to you with a straight face. All right, 24 verses, excuse me, Exodus 4, verses 24 through 26. Here we go. On the way, this is on the way back to Egypt after having met God. On the way, at a place where they spent the night, the Lord met him, being Moses, and tried to kill him. But Zipporah, his wife, Jethro's daughter, Zipporah, took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it and said, "Truly you are bridegroom of blood to me." So he, God, let him alone. It was then that she said, "A bridegroom of blood by circumcision." So oddly enough, this story does not show up in the lectionary ever to have me preach on it. I can't imagine why it would be avoided. It's just as the shocking reality, right? Why wouldn't you want the priest to say, Father Kenneth, you look like you have an opinion on this story, but you're muted, so you have to unmute yourself if you want to share it.
It's one more of those mysteries.
Right, it's just one more of those mysteries. It's the weird text, right? So after Moses was called to the burning bush in chapter 3, he asked his father-in-law Jethro to let him return to Egypt, left with his wife and his sons, and then this weird event happened. Your priest just cussed a little. Don't pay attention to that. So what might be some problems we'd find in this story? Why is God trying to kill Moses? That seems very odd. And after this great call, this great burning, like why all of a sudden now would God try to, like even the timing of it seems very odd. What is going on with foreskin touched or thrown at feet? That just is bonkers beyond belief. And did I mention that feet in Hebrew is a euphemism for genitals? So Zipporah cut off her son's foreskin and touched it to Moses' genitals. Just so we're all clear. I can already see Catherine just waiting for the sermon on this. If it ever did appear in the lectionary cycle. Weird stuff. So what do? Remember, when we get a weird story, something difficult, we keep calm and stay in the text, right? That's the goal. Don't freak out. Don't just, chalk it up to divine mystery, even though that's an easy move too. Keep calm, stay in the text, and see what the text will show us. So if we do this, we'll find a few ways to a solution. So one way to a solution is to remember Genesis 17, verses 9 through 14. So I'm going to flip there real quick and read that to you. This is in the Abraham cycle, the Abraham narrative. God said to Abraham, "As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between you and me. Throughout your generations, every male among you shall be circumcised when he is 8 days old, including the slave born in your house and the one bought with your money from any foreigner who is not of your offspring. Both the slave born in your house and the one bought with money must be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. And any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off, no pun intended, from the people. He has broken my covenant." So clearly an important part of the covenant. So remember that circumcision is, for dating back to Abraham's time, a truly essential act, that not being uncircumcised wasn't like missing church on Easter or something like that. This is a fundamental rejection of the covenant, because in the word, it's often said in the Hebrew Bible about to make a covenant, but the Hebrew for making a covenant is actually kata, which is to cut a covenant. A covenant is literally something that is cut. And so the use of circumcision as a sign of a covenant is a vivid realization of that. And as it says in Genesis, that the part of the point of circumcision is so that the covenant God has made with you is literally cut into your own body, as a sign that it's so central to who you are, at least if you're a guy. So circumcision is important. So that's one thing to know. So, okay, so there must be something else going on here. After Moses' call at the burning bush, when he prepared to return to his people in Egypt, he hadn't circumcised his family yet. His sons had never been circumcised. The sons he had with Jethro's daughter, Zipporah, Jethro being the Midianite priest. In fact, we don't even technically know if Moses himself has ever been circumcised in this way. It's clear that his sons have not, because Zipporah does that. She circumcises the son, and right here in this story. So that was already, if Moses is going to take on the covenant, take on his role to redeem the people of Israel, he must be someone who is a part of the Abrahamic covenant first. And so that's something that has to happen and that he did not do after the call. So that's one thing scholars know, is that why did God all of a sudden try to kill him? Because God gave him this call, and then Moses, who apparently, I mean, if Zipporah knows about circumcision, odds are Moses knows about circumcision. And so Moses, though, ignores that call and just sets out, and which enrages God, and then Zipporah, of course, saves him. Also, another possibility here is to catch the parallel, right? The way in which think of the way the blood of the Passover saved the people of Israel. The blood of circumcision here is really foreshadowing that Passover act that we're coming. Even right there, when it says that what Zipporah did is she touched the foreskin to Moses's feet or genitals. That Hebrew word is nagah. That's the exact same word used for the way that the blood is painted on the doorpost. It's actually touched on the doorposts. So there's a literary and linguistic connection even between those two acts. That placing of blood to forestall or to stop the divine wrath from coming forward, to the divine mortality, which winds up being brought in that final plague that we just did. And that's why I'm telling this story now, and rather than when it occurred earlier in the text, when we were earlier in Exodus, because I feel like to really get this story, you have to understand the whole experience we did last week of that final plague and that final Passover ritual. Also, notice that it's a woman who saves Moses, right? This is a recurring point in the Hebrew Bible that you will see not just here, but you'll see going forward. We've already seen it in the story of Exodus. Think of the midwives, right? Moses' mother and his sister, the daughter of Pharaoh. Over and over again, you have these women stepping up when men are failing, and these women proving to be these salvific leaders. So these are texts that are really important, particularly for a feminist reading of the text, but I would say just for a plain reading of the text. That women who were not often valued in ancient Near Eastern societies are often coming in as deliverers. And this is a great moment of Zipporah, the foreign woman, stepping in to save the day. Similarly, and that's another recurring theme that we'll see later on, when we'll see other foreign women step in to save the day. Most noticeably, we'll see that with the story of Ruth, who's a Moabite. Also, this mediation of Zipporah on Moses's behalf it's really a foreshadowing of what Moses's job's going to be. A lot of Exodus is Moses standing up for the people and standing between the people and the wrath of God and mediating for them. And so it's such a beautiful thing here that at this beginning of the story, when Moses still doesn't know really who he is and what his job is, Zipporah is the one who shows him who he is meant to be by standing between the just wrath of God and the sin or the failure of Moses to keep covenant. This moment, then, so when you put all that together, this moment really consecrates Moses back to his people. It makes him once more a part of the Abrahamic covenant. This is what enables him, when he goes back to them, to be a faithful leader who truly is one of the people, because being a part of the people of God is not simply a matter of blood in the sense of genealogy, but is much more a matter of blood in the sense of the circumcision. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute you all. Questions, comments, thoughts you might have while I take a bite of manicotti?
It's so interesting to me that when you talk about how women save the day over and over again in the Bible, and yet for such a long time, women have been, subjugated in the church and denied any kind of power or any kind of role or any kind of, they couldn't be ordained, they couldn't, and all that. And that's fascinating to me.
I think
Because they're scared of us.
right.
Yeah.
Well,
And they should be.
Well, that's the thing. You read over and over again, the men screw it up and the women come in and fix it, right? So I mean, I think that how did people read it this way for so long? I think that's a very fair question to ask, because To me, a lot of this is just very obvious and profound. I remember when I was being raised in a church that didn't have women in leadership, it was really studying texts like this in college that made me rethink my understandings of the role of women in the church. So I'm like,
Mhm.
I don't know, women are pretty significant leaders in the Bible. Why again can't they be leaders in the church? Like, because of a couple things Paul said to a specific congregation, maybe like, because it'd be different if this just like happened once as a weird thing, but it is a motif that goes throughout the Hebrew Bible.
Father Jared, are there any stories like this in other cultures in that region at that time?
That's a very good question, Nancy. So there are definitely other stories that have strong female characters, strong female leads. Absolutely. Whether or not there are any that parallel this specific story or the specific, connections between Moses and Zipporah that we see here, I'm not sure. I'd be doubtful of that. But the idea that women can be strong characters is not something that would have been contrary to other narratives. It'd be an interesting study, though, to do a comparison and to see if this is a more common motif in the Hebrew Bible than in other ancient Near Eastern texts. Because if so, that would also be a very interesting comparative point to make historically. Yeah.
Well, the other cultures, the surrounding cultures, didn't need to slip in stories about women having an active role. They had goddesses that could rule and worship, be worshipped. Some of them pretty scary.
Yeah. Good
Well,
point.
in the Gospels, aren't there women that actually who are following Jesus? Aren't they his disciples also? So they would have been part of the society at that point.
Oh,
So
yeah.
why is Paul so against them?
You can understand why in Judaism, perhaps, women would have less of a role because the sign of being part of the covenant community was circumcision, and only men could be circumcised. But the church from the beginning baptized women and men. So in some sense, one could argue that women were not fully members of the community in Judaism, but women are fully members of the community in Christianity.
And that's an important point that St. Paul makes in Colossians 2, where he literally says that baptism is our circumcision. So the idea that those two are connected is something that's deeply tied to Paul's own writing through that, and that is a key point that that circumcision was for one gender, but that baptism is for all people. Both. I would say, both cisgender, transgender, like your gender is not what's fundamentally important when it comes to the way baptism marks you.
So it's more puzzling that the role of women should be diminished in the Christian community than it might be in the Jewish community.
Yeah.
It should never have been a diminished thing in the Christian community.
And it's something that's really been reclaimed in those Jewish traditions that have women rabbis, where some of the greatest rabbis of our time really are actually women. And so I don't know what the percentage of how many Jews exist in traditions that permit the ordination of women to the rabbinic role. But I want to say it's the majority at this point. Certainly the majority in America, I would suggest. So even there, Judaism has evolved and shifted on that question. And for them, a lot of it has been going back and reading these texts differently and realizing maybe we'd read this wrong the whole time. Well, and you can see how that's done, because even the example I did drawing out of Genesis 17, a huge part of that text is the rule for circumcision when it comes to a slave you buy. And now we read that and we're like, yeah, but maybe don't buy slaves, right? But, for centuries, Christians read that, and that is an affirmation that slavery is a part of God's created order. God even worked out how circumcision works among slaves. So, I mean, there's this idea that we've always read the Bible this way means that we've got it right. This is one of the reasons I'm an Anglican, is because it's a church that we always must be reformed, and we always have to ask ourselves, well, yeah, we've always read it that way, but could we have gotten this wrong? even if it's been we've gotten it wrong for the past several hundred years. So
Well,
I don't want to go. Yeah, go ahead, Carol. You get the last comment.
a lot of the people who make the argument that women should not be priests say that they are in fact honoring women, that women have a vital role to play, and it's just not the same as men. And that they have the nurturing role and the leadership role in other areas. And there may be something to that if you say that, okay, but maybe men don't have to be priests. Maybe men can have more of the nurturing role in the family, supporting the home and family. Just recognize different kinds of leadership, but take the gender out of it.
Yeah.
I think an argument in the Roman Church for not ordaining women is that the person presiding at the Eucharist stands in the place of Christ, and so there has to be a likeness to Christ.
Well,
but the likeness was interpreted not in terms of humanity, but in terms of gender.
But Sojourner Truth said, what? You say that women can't be leaders because Christ was a man. Your Christ was born of God and woman. Man had nothing to do with it.
Right. This is true. All right, I'm going to mute you all so we can push on. But I think that I thought that'd be a helpful taking a look at kind of what you probably, if you just sat down to read Exodus, you'd probably read those verses and be like, no idea what the heck that was. But when you kind of take that step back and look at the larger picture and how these things connect and themes that repeat themselves, this is how you see how those texts function. And you're like, oh, this is actually not this text should be in the lectionary. Like, this is a really powerful text. It says a lot of things about the importance of covenant, about the importance of no matter how far gone you are, as Moses is living out with the Midianites in the desert, that you still need to come back to covenant, that God doesn't just wave a hand over and make everything okay, about the important interceding role that we have when it comes to standing between people, a sinful people and the justice of God, that we're called to do in the same way that Zipporah did, that Moses did. All of these themes are important and are present in the Hebrew Bible and help us kind of take a text like this. A lot of times what people do with these texts is it's kind of like when you're eating a piece of steak and you get some gristle, you just kind of cut it off and shove it to the side of your plate or spit it into your napkin and hope no one sees. That in general, that's not the answer with difficult texts in the Bible. Usually, if you actually engage them more deeply, you'll discover there's more going on. So let's go ahead and move into our actual text I want us to run through for today. And that's to start in Exodus 15 verses. I'm going to read a little bit extra for us just to give us a sense of context. Verse 20, and then I'm going to move all the way through to the beginning of chapter 16. So you flip here in my Bible. 15. So this is after the destruction at the Red Sea of Pharaoh's army. Then there's this long song of Moses, which is glorious. And then after the song of Moses, we get in verse 20. Then the prophet Miriam, interesting, right? The prophet Miriam, Aaron's sister, so this would be Moses' sister too, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out after her with tambourines and with dancing. And Miriam sang to them, "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea." Then Moses ordered Israel to set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days into the wilderness and found no water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. That is why it is called Marah. And the people complained against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. And he threw it into the tree, and the water became sweet. There the Lord made for them a statute and ordinance, and there he put them to the test. He said, if you will listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight and give heed to his commandments and keep all his statutes, I will not bring upon you any of the diseases that I brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. And then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, and they camped there by the sea. The whole congregation of Israel set out from Elim, and Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. So what I want us to just notice here is that there's a pattern in this first grumbling text, a pattern that you're going to see over and over and over again as we move through the book of Exodus and indeed other books in the Torah. A problem arises. In this story, the problem is there's no water, but something kind of goes wrong. The people complain, of course, not to God generally, but to Moses. You know, why are you doing this? You're horrible. You know, that sort of thing. It's great being a pastor. Moses intercedes with God on behalf of the people. God responds by providing deliverance. That's kind of the fourfold structure of the grumbling narratives. And it's important to remember these people don't have the law yet. They don't have instructions for worship. They don't have the 10 commandments. All they have is the Abrahamic covenant. But in verse 26, this very first grumbling narrative, God sets out the nature of their relationship, how it is that this will function going forward, a relationship which is going to be established in the wilderness, both at Mount Sinai when they're given the law, but also as they journey through the wilderness over and over again. These are the ground rules for the journey ahead. If you listen to the voice of God, if you do what is right in God's sight, not in your own sight, and that's an important phrase that'll come up later in the Hebrew Bible, give heed to his commandments, keep all of his statutes, then God won't bring destruction upon you, for I am the Lord who heals you. So it's not only like, do what I say and I won't beat you up, which is kind of a little angry and mean, but it's, if you listen to me, I will be able to heal you. I will be able to make you whole when you enter into these experiences of struggle and lack in the desert, because that's who I am. That is fundamental. Your job is to be my people, and my job is to care for you and heal you. And if you listen to me, I can do that. I can heal you. I can give you water. I can give you food. All of these things that will happen throughout. So that's kind of encapsulated right here in that first narrative story. Does that make sense? Feel free to unmute yourself if you have any questions, comments, anything at all. Sounds good. All right. So let's push through. And then we're going to get the actual giving of the law itself in Exodus 19. And this is a lengthier reading, but we often don't read this chapter probably in its totality. And it's really worth it for getting a sense of what's happening at the giving of the law. Exodus 19, starting in verse 1. On the new moon, after the Israelites had gone out from the land of Egypt, on that very day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. They had journeyed from Rephidim, entered the wilderness of Sinai, and camped in the wilderness. Israel camped there in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up to God. The Lord called him from the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the Israelites, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the Israelites. So Moses came, summoned the elders of the people, and set before them all these words that the Lord commanded him. And the people all answered as one, everything that the Lord has spoken we will do. Moses reported the words of the people to the Lord. The Lord said to Moses, I am going to come to you in a dense cloud in order that the people may hear when I speak with you and so trust you ever after. When Moses had told the words of the people to the Lord said to Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. Have them wash their clothes and prepare for the third day, because on the third day the Lord will come down upon Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. You shall set limits for the people all around, saying, be careful not to go up the mountain or to touch the edge of it. Any who touch the mountain shall be put to death. No hand shall touch them, but they shall be stoned or shot with arrows. Whether animal or human being, they shall not live. When the trumpet sounds a long blast, then they may go up on the mountain. So Moses went down from the mountain to the people. He consecrated the people, and they washed their clothes. And he said to the people, prepare for the third day. Do not go near a woman. And on the third morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning, as well as a thick cloud upon the mountain, and a blast of a trumpet so loud that the people who were in the camp trembled. And Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God. What a great line, right? They took their stand at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended upon it in fire. The smoke went up like the smoke of a kiln, while the whole mountain shook violently. As the blast of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses would speak, and God would answer him in thunder. When the Lord descended upon Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, the Lord summoned Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. The Lord said to Moses, go down and warn the people not to break through to the Lord to look, otherwise many of them will perish. Even the priests who approach the Lord must consecrate themselves, or the Lord will break out against them. And Moses said to the Lord, the people are not permitted to come up to Mount Sinai, for you yourself warned us, saying, set limits around the mountain and keep it holy. And the Lord said to him, go down and come up, bringing Aaron with you, but do not let either the priests or the people break through to come up to the Lord, otherwise he will break out against them. So Moses went down to the people and told them. Then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. So that is, to me, that is such fantastic storytelling. The building of this moment of God descending in that cloud, which is of course echoing, right? The cloud and the smoke and the cloud and the fire, which had been present with Abraham at the covenant, which had been present with the people at the Red Sea, and which now descends upon Mount Sinai so that the people can receive the law. So as we dig into this, there are a few kind of key points to kind of call out for you all. The rest of the book of Exodus, I'm sorry, I keep forgetting to put the end parentheses in, plus Leviticus and Numbers 1 through 10 or 11, all of that takes place on Mount Sinai. So like that's like the almost everything that we're doing for the rest of this book. Not exactly everything, but almost everything is all happening on Mount Sinai. This period on Mount Sinai of the giving of the law occupies 11 months of time, and it's foundational to the future of this. So like Moses goes up there and like picks up a package from FedEx with like a Bible. He's like, "Hey, got it. Let's go." Like this is an 11-month period of God present on the mountain and the law being given. And also important to remember is the covenant that's given, the law that's given on Mount Sinai is a specific covenant within an already existing covenant community. Remember, these have already been a people who are covenanted to God because of the covenant of Abraham, that's why that circumcision point earlier in Exodus was so essential. To be clear, God's not doing something new. Rather, God is taking a people God has already covenanted to himself and is now giving them a deeper covenant to draw that relationship together. These people had already been elected, redeemed, believed, they already worshiped. All of these things were there before the law is given in Exodus. The law in Exodus is given as a specific deepening of all of those relationships. And the law as it is given does not stand alone, but is interwoven with narrative. And we'll see that through the rest of Exodus, is that there'll be things that happen in the law, and then there'll be some stories that are told, and it kind of goes back and forth. And that's such an essential thing. So you can't take any of these sections of law and kind of pull them out and be like, so this is what we must do. You have to take those and read those with the narrative. In the same way, you can't take some of the narrative out without paying attention to what happened in the law that preceded it. And I talked about this before when you come to the failure of the people, and we'll get to that in a little bit here when they fell with the golden calf. But those two things have to be seen as kind of interwoven together. And you see that interweaving similar to how we saw ritual and narrative in the previous section of Exodus we talked about. You get story, then the law and the Decalogue. Story, law and of the covenant code. Story, tabernacle, priesthood. Story, tabernacle. So you're getting this kind of that same book ending, which is telling you that you have to be reading these things alongside each other if you want to truly understand what God is doing and what the text is doing with these. So before I get into the people screwing it up in Exodus 32, questions, comments, thoughts, feel free to unmute yourself if you have any.
So how come it changes from don't touch the mountain to don't touch a woman?
Oh, so the good question. So don't touch a woman. So the act of sex is makes you ritually impure. And so it's all about you have to be holy. And so to have sex to give yourself carnally to another human being kind of makes you impure for a period of time in the thought of the Hebrew Bible. And so the mountain you don't touch, because the mountain is where God is and it's massively holy, and you're, no matter how hard you try to make yourself pure, you're not worthy of the mountain. And it's kind of the opposite for women. That he's telling the people basically, don't go get laid because important stuff is happening. This is not the time for frivolity, which plays an important role in what's going to happen in Exodus 32, as I'll articulate in a little bit. But yeah, he's wanting the people, like, this is not a time for, pleasures and party. This is a time to consecrate yourself to God, to enter into this period of being separate and apart so that you can be fully present with God as this moment happens. Great question. Other comments,
I think
questions?
that's partly because sex is sort of a selfish act. Even when you're doing with someone you love,
I don't know if I would declare it as a selfish act, even in the ways, because in the Hebrew Bible, of course, it can be understood in that way, and you see examples of that, particularly in some stories in Genesis and elsewhere. But sex in its proper form is always a giving of yourself act as opposed to a taking for yourself act, particularly giving of yourself when it comes to the role of procreation in sex, but not just of that. It's always this kind of giving of yourself to the other. So I don't think it's about that. I think it is about, in the same way that, if I'm going to, let's say, like, we're going to decide whether or not to, like, sell St. John's, we're going to have a meeting. So I'd be like, so when we come to the meeting, like, don't show up drunk. We're not going to have, like, a lot of, like, super rich food to really have a lot of fun. We're not going to have loud music and partying. And, it's so all of the deep, the pleasures of life, the things that delight you, hold yourself back from them for a period of time. Because when you do, that creates a clarity of senses. This is the whole point of the fasting tradition as it exists in scripture and in tradition, is you hold yourself back from the pleasures of life. And when you do that, it allows you to singularly focus on God. And I think that that's actually the thing with with sex, is in sex, you're so focused on the other person, on your partner, that your attention is going to be of course divided. So it's saying, pull yourself away from all of that, so that you can focus wholly and solely on God in this moment, because this is an essential thing that's happening. Good questions. Other questions or thoughts before we dive more deeply?
So interesting that it doesn't say don't go near your wife. It just says don't go near a woman.
Right. Yeah. That's a little.
So there's a kind of more generalized canoodling that he's talking about.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and also it's not don't go near your spouse, right? The women aren't warned about staying away from men. And so part of this as well is that these texts also have a patriarchal lens through which they're read, in which they were written.
Of course.
And so, like, of course, like, the danger, like, it's the women are going to lead you astray from God. So there is some of that going on here that I feel very comfortable being like, well, that's probably not the best way of understanding things. But yeah, good
Sex
point.
is generally understood to be yucky. But beyond that, it is powerful, it is mysterious, it is dangerous. So it's important, it's good, but you need some controls. You need hedge it around with all kinds of recommendations and prohibitions to make it safe.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Well, because it's one of the ways in which we participate in the very creative powers of God, and it's one of the ways we participate in the dance of love between the persons of the Trinity. Like there are divine things going on in sex when it's done well and properly and faithfully, and so it is a deeply powerful act. So. Good. Well, let's not talk about sex anymore because I'm getting distracted. So let's move to Exodus 32, where the people of Israel kind of screw it up. So this is 32. I'm going to kind of do this one bit by bit since we just had this one in the lectionary relatively recently. So when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, immediately, like this is not like he'd been up there for a half hour and they give up. Remember, this is a long period of time. When the people saw Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said to him, "Come, make gods for us who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what became of him." Aaron said to them, "Take off the gold rings that are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the gold rings from their ears and brought them to Aaron. He took the gold from them and formed it in a mold and cast an image of a calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." And when Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a festival to the Lord, Yahweh." They rose early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought sacrifices of well-being, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to revel. So after 6 powerful chapters of the law, which is what has preceded this story, setting out the moral and the religious foundations of the chosen people, there's this kind of blast of cold air. It's almost like Genesis 3 once more, where the people had this possibility of tremendous intimacy and closeness with God and just squandered it right here off the get-gap. And this is why I'm saying read the story in conversation with the ritual. When people read through Exodus, they tend to skip over all the stuff about the law and the ritual just to get to the juicy story. And you miss it because the whole point of what's going on here is that the golden calf narrative is in contrast to the tabernacle instructions. And the whole point of what has just followed has been the tabernacle instructions, the tent of meeting, the worship instructions. So the people create a golden calf, whereas God has already provided a means for his presence. So they're circumventing that. They, rather than God, take the initiative for having experience. God is taking the initiative. He's giving this experience, these tabernacle instructions to take the initiative. The people are wresting that away from God and saying, "No, we want to experience God on our own terms." Offerings are demanded rather than willingly given. Aaron doesn't say, "So we could do this. You could maybe donate some money." He says, "Take off your gold. We're going to make this happen." The offerings that are given in the creation of the tabernacle are offerings that the people give willingly. They're not demanded of the leadership. The elaborate preparations that are absent, the creation of the space for God's presence in the tabernacle is massively difficult. It's an elaborate preparation to create this space where God will become present. All of that is gone. This is literally an overnight job, right? The painstaking length of time becomes something we just kind of knock out as though you're cramming for an exam in college. And the careful provision for guarding the Holy One, for guarding holy, the tabernacle is all about setting aside and guarding sacred space. It's very carefully thought through. With the golden calf, everything's out in the open, everything's accessible, there are no boundaries. And that's actually not good. And we have to remember that sometimes as a church that believes, everyone should be welcome. Yeah, everyone should be welcome, but you still need boundaries, because if you have no boundaries in your body, physiologically, that's how cancer happens. Cancer are cells that know no boundaries. If you have no boundaries in the church, You have no conceptualization of sacred and secular. You have no conceptualization of holiness, of setting things apart, of consecrating things. So all of that careful provision that's in the ritual code is being ignored. We're like, we'll just set up the idol and we'll just, have a great time. The invisible and intangible God, who's only ever seen so far in fire and in smoke by the people, becomes the opposite, becomes something you can see right there. I can even like put my finger on God's nose, boop, boop, like that. That's the opposite of how God functions in this text. And the personal and active God becomes an impersonal object. So God is talking and doing and driving the story. And what the people create in place of that is just an object that they can then call as God, that has no personal identity. In all of this, the people forfeit the divine presence that they had hoped to bind to themselves. That divine presence which is on the mountain, that is giving them the mechanisms by which they may be fully with God. They're forfeiting that because they don't want the work. They don't want the time. They don't want the wait. And this is primarily not about violating the law. This is not about the fact that they made an idol and idols are contrary to the 10 Commandments. This is about a violation of relationship. Because what is it that they say when they have the golden calf? These are the gods who brought us out of that brought them out of Egypt. And then Aaron says, we'll make this a feast to Yahweh. He even gives that name, the personal name of God that had been revealed to Moses in this sacred moment. He gives that name callously and blasphemously to this calf. It's about that God, the relationship they have with God, this God who has chosen them, wants to care for them, wants to be the Lord who heals them. They're casting all of that aside. This is why in later texts of the Hebrew Bible, so often the prophets will describe the sin of the people as being, it's like a spouse cheating on your beloved. Because it's not about the reason the infidelity is such a painful thing. It's not just because there's some rule that says you shouldn't do it, because it feels like a violation of the very relationship which is at the basis of who you are as a people. And so people who have experienced infidelity, it wounds them in very deep ways, very different than other types of sin that can exist in a marriage. It says they sat down to eat and rose up to revel. That Hebrew word there for revel, the King James Version, if you're remembering that, I think is all they sat down to eat and rose up to play. The Hebrew word there is sachak. This is the exact same verb used for Potiphar's wife in Genesis 39:14, where she says, and you brought this Hebrew into the house to mock me, to play with me. So it's not revel. It's a humiliation, a mocking, and often with sexual overtones. It's that she was saying, you brought this Hebrew in here to have his way with me sexually in a humiliating way. So that's what the people are doing, is they rise up to revel, which is generally a lot of commentators often say that they rose up and engaged in sexual sin as well, which connects, right, to what God had just said, listen, can you keep it in your pants for a little bit of time? We're having church now. And the people sit down to eat and drink and rise up to revel. So that's a big part of what's going on too. So in response to this sin, God desires punishment. The Lord says to Moses in verse 7, go down at once. Your people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt have acted perversely. They've been quick to turn aside from the way that I commanded them. They have cast for themselves an image of a calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And the Lord said to Moses, I've seen this people, how stiff-necked they are. Now let me alone, so that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, and of you I will make a great nation. So notice God here is mimicking the words of the people. They're saying that these are the gods who saved us from Egypt. But not only is he mimicking them, he's disowning his own divine role. Because what he says to Moses, your people, Moses, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt. So there's a very specific. The God is not just angry and mimicking here, but he is pushing back in a very strong way and saying, I have nothing to do with these people. God, in effect, is giving what they want, right? They want this golden calf to be the God that saved them from Egypt. And God says, fine, then fine. I had nothing to do with saving you if that's what you want. Go for it. The world is yours. Let me alone means God has decided to execute wrath, but not finally and completely. God is saying to Moses, leave me alone. Don't talk me out of it. I want to do this. This is what needs to happen for my justice to be met, right? And God also offers Moses this tantalizing possibility. I'm going to destroy them. And then guess what, Moses? You will become a great people. I will make the whole Abrahamic covenant will be destroyed for them, and you will be the new person through whom I make my promised people come about. So then Moses intercedes, beginning in verse 11. But Moses implored the Lord his God and said, O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people whom you brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, it was with evil intent God brought them out to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce wrath, change your mind, and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, how you swore to them by your own self, saying to them, I will multiply your descendants like the stars of the heaven. And all of this land that I have promised I will give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever. And the Lord changed his mind about the disaster he planned to bring on his people. So Moses does not leave God alone, right? He does not leave God alone. He intercedes just as Zipporah had interceded for him, and just as he had in the wilderness before this, and will continue later in the wilderness wandering, that when the people's sin runs up against the justice of God, he doesn't back off and say, not my problem. You all did this, but he places himself in that place to say to that place to find that mercy and that healing. And no, God has invited this relationship. God is not, God could have just killed the people. He didn't need to kind of check in with Moses first. Moses isn't in charge. But God is inviting Moses to have a salvific role, is inviting Moses to be the sort of leader who will not just give up on the people when they fail. Moses rejects being his own nation because, remember, through that Zipporah story, he has already been consecrated a son of Abraham. That once again is why that text is so important. He's saying, I am a son, I am a child of Abraham, and I'm not going to let that covenant be put aside, because I am only here not by virtue of my own righteousness or faithfulness, but I am only here by virtue of who I am as a son of Abraham. And so he appeals to God's reasonableness, God's reputation, and God's own promise. He appeals to his reasonableness. Why in the world would you do this given everything you've done? His reputation. What is everyone going to say? What are the Egyptians going to say if you just murder this people? And God's own promise that God had made to the patriarchs. That this stands at the basis of Moses's response. And so God repents, changes his mind. Technically, in the Hebrew, nacham is usually translated as repent, not of the, of the disaster, of the ra, the evil, the bad thing he intended to do. This is echoes, right, of Genesis 18, where God interceded on behalf of Sodom and Gomorrah, and God changed his mind. So even though the Hebrew word here is the word we would often translate as repentance, this is not turning from sin. God's actions in the Hebrew Bible are always just. God is repenting, is turning from an evil. Evil in Hebrew scripture, ra, refers to anything in life that makes for less than total peace and well-being. Anything wrong, bad, that's less than the best of what the world could be, including divine judgment, because of course judgment is not the best thing. Shalom, peace, is the best thing. And so God is turning from that ra, is turning from that breaking of shalom, that breaking of peace. At Moses' invitation. This does not remove consequences, though. The people will still face consequence for the sin of the golden calf, as you'll read later in Exodus. It just means that the consequences that they receive are mitigated by divine grace. They're not as severe as they truly could have been. So I'm going to real quick stop the screen share. and put us back our gallery view here. For final, we're at the end of our time. I kind of had to push through that last bit a little quickly, but comments, thoughts, questions before we wrap up for the night?
I just have one question. Why is there a reason that they chose to make a calf? I know cows are considered sacred in some. Is there some symbolism for the calf being chosen?
Yeah, a lot of ancient Near Eastern cultures, calves will be used, calves or bulls or cows will be used as a fertility image. So it's a, if you think about it, it's a beast that is powerful and so kind of creates a sense of strength. Also a beast which has tremendous value to people who have it. So it's a very valuable animal. And so it's a common image used for the divine is the use of a calf or a cow or a bull. And how you I have to look up the Hebrew word actually used there, why it's translated here as calf, if it actually means a baby cow. Because that's what we think we were a calf, because like, why do a baby? Like, why do a bull? Like, some great Scottish Highland bull, like something like that. Don't do like a little baby cow.
Maybe they didn't have enough gold to make a bull.
Right? Yeah, right. But and that's the other thing that I didn't mention this about that gold. Where did they get that gold? The looting of Egypt, right? They were slaves. God had turned the heart of the Egyptians so that they would take. They had been serving unjustly for hundreds. These are their reparations. So think of it that way. If we as a country finally did reparations for African American people, and those reparations were turned and just burned away. I mean, that gold had that symbolizes the justice that God. He didn't just save them from Egypt. He gave them the wealth that was theirs that they deserved, and they squandered it to get an idol they could touch. I mean, that whole point that this is not about simply a question of violating a law, but this is a violation of the very relationship they have with God. It's just so profound. Other questions, comments, thoughts?
Is there any significance to Aaron was I guess you look at him as a leader, and it's like, why wasn't Aaron held more accountable than the rest of the people? But it seems like, all right, Aaron's on the same level as everyone else instead of higher expectations for him.
Yeah, Aaron is a fascinating character in the Hebrew Bible, in particular in the Exodus text. There are times at which he seems to be a very important figure, and other times he seems to be a little less than one, like in this text right here. And some scholars have suggested that these kind of unflattering stories about Aaron are actually written in the time when there was a rejection of the Aaronic priesthood. The priesthood which descends from Aaron was seen as fundamentally flawed and unjust. And that this is actually later polemic against the priestly descendants of Aaron, more so than actual a reflection of who Aaron was probably as a historical figure. Now that's just supposition in theory. We can't know that for sure. But Aaron definitely seems a pretty flawed person, which of course, I mean, all of these characters are. I mean, that's one thing I love about the Bible is like people just hit their breaking point and they screw up. Just like talking about my sermon on Sunday when Moses got all ticked off with the people with the water and, called them a bunch of rebels and hit this rock instead of talking to the rock and all of that. Like, people hit their limit, and I don't know why Aaron hit his limit here, but for whatever reason he did. So yeah, there could be some later polemic going on. It could just be that all of these characters screw it up from time to time. Yeah, it's kind of a mystery. Sorry, not a good answer.
It is a good answer. Thank you.
Any other comments, questions, thoughts?
Well, I can't resist bringing up that little point about Aaron that I think I mentioned in the lectionary study, because a little later on in the same chapter, Moses is asking Aaron, "Why did you do this?" And Aaron says, "I said to them, whoever has gold, take it off." So they gave it to me, and I threw it in the fire, and out came this fire.
If you didn't hear that, there was a little up on my screen. Yeah. So what Aaron says is, I'm going to mute you all real quick so it doesn't get lost. What Aaron says when Moses asks him about it, he says, "Well, I fire, I gold into it, and a calf came out. What am I gonna do? What am I gonna do?" It is kind of a ridiculous excuse. Which is also something we see in the text from time to time, right? We see these people, some people confronted with their sin are contrite and turn immediately. Other people, like literally my 4-year-old daughter, Lucy, could come up with a better excuse than that for when she screws it up. Like seriously, people. All right, well, that is our time for tonight. Thank you all so much for a good discussion. I'll send out an email tomorrow with the reading assignments, but we will be moving out of the book of Exodus and starting to do some further readings in the Torah. So I'll send you those specific readings once I finalize my class preparation stuff sometime tomorrow or the day after. So until then, have a lovely evening. Good to be with you all.
Thank you.
Good night.